wow, I'm a minute early. That's unheard of. So, if anyone's listening, I will probably do my usual 10-15 minutes and then I'm going to get into this because it is the story actually needs it needs covering. It needs to be delivered with the respect that I think is deserved. So it's probably not going to be my usual light-hearted type of live. So that's just... Hi, Cassius. How are you doing, Chuck? Still making me laugh, that Brokeback Jaggy Ass Mountain. Oh, it's great you're joining us. Thank you very much. You can't really see the title, can you, on this one? But this is about giving Jack the Ripper's... that's it. Hi, hello, Mr. up in Newcastle. Have you finished work for the day? Brokeback Jaggy Ass Mountain is Cassius, by the way. He's got stuck with that name. Hi, Simples. Hello. So, yeah. So we can probably have a bit of a laugh and a joke after, but I've done quite a bit of research on this. So, you're running a bath, a cold bath. Yeah, pork chops up in your neck of the woods, Simples. Oh well, while you're having your bath, you can listen to what I hope is the real story of Polly Nichols. As I said the other day, for people who are just watching at the moment and those of you in chat, poor lad. Yeah, he's in a hotel that's got cold water for the bath and the shower, unless it's been sorted. I think everybody who was staying there was having the same cold baths, cold showers. So my thoughts on doing this, and I'm going to do it in a series. Tonight, I'm only going to cover Polly Nichols. But what always happens with a murder, as we know, is that the focus is always on the murderer. You know, who they were, what the background was, what they did. I mean, how many people... obviously Jack the Ripper is different because we do all know the names of the victims because it's the most famous cold case of all time. But, you know, think about Jeffrey Dahmer. Can anybody name his victims? Hi, Baghead, you all right, love? Can anybody name any of Dahmer's victims? Unless you're an aficionado of that particular case, probably not. The same with Fred and Rose West. Yeah, we know some of them were kids, but I couldn't name one of their victims. I actually genuinely can't name any of the Yorkshire Ripper's victims either. So that kind of was what got me started on this. And I just... no problem, Simples, you can have a listen in, because I'm probably not going to be watching the chat as much as I normally do, just because I'm wanting to deliver this with the respect that I think it deserves. And it got me thinking about the victims of Jack the Ripper. As you all know, I am obsessed with Jack the Ripper. There are a couple of cases that I throw myself into, not being a true crime fanatic. One of them is Jack the Ripper. And for years, I have had the same opinion as everybody else about his victims. And that's what we're going to address tonight, because I have recently, well, some information and done a little bit more digging than I should have done. Sorry, that I should have done in the past. So, what time are we on now? Nearly 5 past. I'll just give it a couple more minutes and then I will, I'll get into it. So how is everybody? Are you all okay? It's gone really cold here. I just nipped to the shop. I forgot I needed some cream for my coffee, and I thought I'll just nip out before my live starts, and I'm absolutely pigging freezing. Yeah, it's really cold here. The temperature's dropped here as well, so I thought it would be very cold, like the northeast and north of the border. But yeah, it's absolutely fucking freezing. So I've got my hoodie on, got the hoodie out of the wardrobe. Um, I'm not putting the heating on. I've got a hot water bottle and the hoodie. Hi, Frida. Just nipping into the shower, but catch up. Not a problem. I will. No, it's not. It's not. It's not on at all. Had some of the tooth and gum removed today, so might not. Oh gosh. Oh no. Do you know? I nearly messaged you as well to see how you were doing, Wicken. Oh God, I bet that is so painful. Well, you don't need to speak or anything. You'll be absolutely fine. You can just have a listen in, and um, hopefully you'll enjoy this one. So, excusez-moi. Right, I'm going to make a start so that I'm not keeping everybody lingering, and then we can have a proper chat later on. I will stop every so often to look through the chat just to see if anybody has any questions or you've got anything that you've thrown in. It's not a mega long one because I want to do um, a different one of his victims. I want to do a different victim each live. I don't want to do them all because I want, in one go. I want to give them the attention really. So just for anybody who isn't sure, excuse me, I'm so sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. We have got the canonical five, which we've discussed before. So the canonical five are the five victims that everybody agrees on. Some people think there were more, but these five victims. So we've got Mary Ann, also known as Polly Nichols, who was 43 years old. The next victim was Annie Chapman, who was 47 years old. The third victim was Elizabeth Stride, also known as Long Liz, and she was 44 years old. Catherine Eddowes, who was 46 years old, and then the final victim was Mary Jane Kelly, also known as Marie Jeanette Kelly, who was 24 or 25 years old at the time of her murder. So these ladies, they were victims of Jack the Ripper, but in my opinion, humble or not, they were also victims of police prejudice and media misogyny. We all think we know their stories because the stories were written, over 130 years ago by men who had a very poor view of women of that particular social class. Now, as a result of that, they became lost as victims. So what I wanted to do is give them their stories back. So let's go on to history's most famous cold case. Right, so I'm going to start at 3:45 a.m. on Friday the 31st of August in 1988. And the place we're going to is a place called Bucks Row, which was in Whitechapel in London. Now, it was a couple of hours before dawn, and a young police officer, PC John Neal, was walking his beat around Whitechapel. It was unusual because he was a lone beat bobby. Most of the areas around Whitechapel, they were considered so dangerous that policemen would not walk those beats alone. He was lucky his was one of the lesser or the less dangerous beats. So he was walking that beat on his own. Now, he got to Bucks Row and he saw that there was a body lying on the ground. What you've got to remember is that there are no street lights around there. There's very little secondary light because any of the overlooking buildings have got the curtains, tightly closed. If they had any light at all, it would have been from a candle, and the likelihood is that the candle would have been away from the window, so it didn't get blown out in a draft. So there was very, very little light. And from what we can gather, from what he described it as, it was absolutely pitch black. Now, PC Neil did have a light, and it was his police issue oil lantern. So it was like a little, the little handheld lanterns that you see on Christmas cards and what have you, of like Victorian or Georgian England. It was like that. Now, it didn't give fantastic light, it didn't give a good arc of light, but it gave enough. And it gave enough for him to see that the person, the body that was lying on the floor, it was immobile and it was a woman. He noticed that her bonnet had fallen off her head, and that's actually lying by her left hand. And her skirts, because obviously it wasn't just one skirt, there were layers, petticoats and whatnot. They were hitched up to her knees. And he could also see by this weak lamplight that her throat had been severely cut, and there was actually blood still oozing from the wound. When he touched her, her body was still warm. And he also described her hands as being empty and open and by her sides. Now, he called a doctor, and the doctor made a rather cursory examination in situ and pronounced her dead at the scene. And he also at that time suggested that she's been dead for only 30 minutes. So the first major lead that they got on who this woman was at around 5 a.m. So it's just slightly over an hour after she'd been found. Now, Inspector Spratling attended the mortuary, and what he wanted to do was record a description of the victim and her possessions. Oh, did you say have I gone? And the dog starts barking. Sorry about this, guys. Whereabouts did I go from there, Simples? If somebody could let me know where they heard up to. It's not done this for flipping ages. Anybody? Oh gosh. Let me see. I'll just hang on until anybody comes back. Oh, you can. Oh, right. It was with them. Simple saying gone. Do you know? Hi, Night Owl. Does anybody know where? Could you tell me where you heard up to before I vanished? Because I don't want to miss any of this out, because it's actually laying the foundations for the story. Come on in, Night Owl. I'm just waiting until somebody can tell me where they heard up to. Because Simple said I'd gone. So I don't want to repeat everything, but I also don't want to miss anything out. So if somebody can give me a pointer, I shall carry on. I don't know if this is a severe lag or something, or a delay. Oh, the one was at 5 o'clock. Thank you, Brian. Thank you very much. Okay, so as I said, the first major lead is about 5 o'clock. Inspector Spatling attended the mortuary, and he wanted to record a description of the victim and her possessions. Okay, hands were empty and open. Oh, right. Okay, I'll just I'll finish that little bit, then I'll go back to that. So her hands are empty, they're open, and they're by her side. A doctor was called. He made a rather cursory examination at the scene. He pronounced her dead, and he also suggested that she'd been dead for only 30 minutes at that time. So, and don't forget, PC Neal found her. The wound on her neck was still oozing blood, and she was still warm. So, again, I'll start this little bit. The first major lead came at around 5 a.m. So it's just over an hour after she'd been found. Inspector Spratling attended the mortuary. He wanted to record a description of the victim and her possessions so that they could try and identify her. Now, what was really interesting is that some of the clothes she was wearing were marked PR, Prince's Road, and that's a workhouse. So the first question was she homeless? Because if she was, that puts her in a much more vulnerable group. Now, at the mortuary, they then had called an inhabitant of the Prince's Road workhouse to come and see if he recognised, he or she, sorry, I'm presuming it was a man, if he or she recognised this deceased person. And this workhouse inhabitant identified the body as Mary Ann Nichols and said she was also known as Polly. So, this is where I am going to talk about Polly. So this is her background as far as I've been able to ascertain. She was born Mary Ann Walker, and she was the second of 3 children. Her father was a blacksmith, and he was in full-time employment, and her mother was a laundress. Now, for both parents of a working class family in London to both be in full-time employment is, that was quite singular for the time. It put them in a very, very good position. It was not that common to have, if not one, but especially both parents working. So they were, it could be presumed that they were actually very comfortably off. Now, when Mary Ann was 7, her mother died of tuberculosis. But from what we can gather, it was a very strong family unit because her father was a good father. You hear all these stories in Victorian England that, some fathers, they were very harsh, they would beat the children. A lot of the times, and it's awful to say it, but a bit of SA going on in the family was not uncommon around that time. But Mary Ann's dad was actually a good dad. He insisted that Polly continued her schooling, which was very unusual because this is before compulsory education. So don't forget, you have to pay for education, and not many working class families had the spare cash to do this, to educate their children. Generally they got to a certain age and they went out to work in whichever menial role that they could find. But he insisted that his children were educated. Not only was it unusual that he was paying for the education, but he was paying for a daughter to be educated. Because don't forget, this is pre women getting the vote. Women were we were second class citizens. We didn't have the same rights as men. We didn't really have that much of a voice, and especially not in the lower classes. They were even more rejected, neglected, and ignored. So her dad was actually a really good father, and he was wanting her to have, to me, a really good start and a really good foundation. Now, at 18, Mary Ann then married a gentleman called William Nichols. And as time went on, children came along, and then they were recommended as a couple, and because they were both in employment, they were recommended for a place in what was called it was this new Peabody estate. Now, most working class people in London at that time, London and especially Whitechapel, the accommodation was horrendous. It was dirty. It was disease ridden. There were very unscrupulous characters sharing the different tenements or buildings or houses. You very rarely had a house to yourself. You know, there could be two, three, four, even more families sharing one dwelling. So they actually were then recommended and put forward. Oh, sorry, I just lost my place and I think they were put forward for this position in the Peabody estate. Now, this provided cleaner, healthier accommodation than the majority of working class Londoners could get. And the places in the Peabody estate were reserved for hard-working, respectable tenants like Polly and her family. So the whole family upped and moved and ended up in the Peabody estates. But then the rot started to set in. Now, her husband claimed that Polly was drinking heavily and he suggested that she was perhaps indulging in immoral behaviour. But Polly's father, now he disagreed with this and he said that the root of their problems was that William was having an affair. Obviously, William isn't going to admit that. So eventually, Polly upped and left the family home and her children, and she went straight to the workhouse. So she's obviously in, you know, it's really dire times for her. And it's agreed while she's there that her husband is to pay her some small maintenance. Well, William doesn't want to do that for very long, and in the eyes of the law, all he has to do is to prove in any way that she's dependent on another man. And if he can do that, he can then stop paying her this maintenance. So she was actually shown to be dependent on another man. Now, what you have to remember that at that time it was incredibly hard for a woman who was in and out of a workhouse, who had the odd nights on the street. If they didn't have a man to protect them, life was very difficult and very, very dangerous. Because Polly had left her husband for whatever reason, she'd left her children and she'd left the family home. She was an outcast. You know, society looked on her as an outcast. And unfortunately, as an outcast, that then put her as an available target for the killer. You know, she was just an opportunity there waiting to be picked up. Now, so that's Polly's background. Okay, it's sad, but you know, there's nothing horrendous there. Now, within days of a murder, her murder is linked to, by the press, to two other murders that occurred in the past year. But the problem was that they rushed to connect these killings. You know, it's a bit of sensationalism. The press wanted to get on with the story. You know, this was nice and juicy, but the rush to connect the killings, that would haunt the case, and it actually tainted the case as well. Now, if you think about it, finding, especially at that time, and especially in Whitechapel, you know, there were so many murders going on every day. It was not unusual to find people dead in the street when you got up in the morning. I know we've talked about this before, but finding a woman murdered in the middle of London isn't that surprising, you know, at that time. However, the middle class press picked it up. The Times, amongst others, labelled all three of the victims as unfortunates. But they had no way of knowing this. It was no more than the way they looked at it was that they're poor, so they're very probably working as prostitutes. And that assumption was allowed to carry, and it also affected the case. It affected how the public looked on these women. It affected how the police looked on these women. Now, was she really a prostitute, as the press presumed? Well, this word seems to have been pushed onto the case by outsiders. These were people who, they didn't live in the area, they didn't work in the area, they didn't know the people involved, they weren't top investigators, they weren't part of the police. These were reporters and commentators. They were nobody. And sometimes this was after the fact. So these weren't people who were involved in this case at that time. But also, you've got to remember as well that there was a lot of animosity between the police and the press at the time, because reporters considered themselves to be investigators, and they didn't see why the police should have sole investigative rights over murders. Why are the police not allowed to say stuff? Anyway, so the foundations of this story about these three women, and the first two are completely unrelated. However, it's about it. Well, it's as shaky as all hell. We've got a prostitute killer. When his very first victim, and we're going to go with with Mary Ann Polly, she actually wasn't one. So if she wasn't a prostitute, is everything else that we think about Jack's motives, could that be wrong as well? We've got him down as a prostitute killer. I know I have my own theories, although my theory would fit whether these ladies were prostitutes or not. I'm not giving myself a free pass there, because I've always considered these women to be prostitutes, because I've run with the 1888 narrative that very few people have questioned. It's started to be questioned now, thankfully. So we just go back, a little recap. A couple of hours before dawn, so Polly's found with her throat cut, and within days she's been branded as a prostitute. So the hunt's on for a prostitute killer. But are the press too quick to judge her? And are the detectives heading down the wrong path? Is there any evidence that Polly was a sex worker? So, was she poor? Yes, she was. Was she a drinker? Yes, she was. And she would drink with her friends, but there is no evidence whatsoever of any immoral behaviour. The press were desperate. Reporters would talk to people who knew her, and they were trying to drag this information out. Was she walking the streets? She wasn't. Nobody could say to the press, yes, she's a prostitute. Yes, we've seen her indulging in immoral behaviour. Yes, I know that that's how she paid for a bed for the night. There are no records whatsoever of her ever having been arrested for solicitation. There's no proof whatsoever. This proof is just what was conjured up by the press. So, why she had this label for over 130 years. Victorian society was very, very quick to condemn any woman who stepped out of the standard pattern of acceptable behaviour. So, you really had three, possibly four options. So you either were an unmarried daughter who was still living at home with parents. You were a wife who was living with her husband. You could be perhaps a widow living alone, or you could be a nun. Anything else outside of that wasn't acceptable. Now, Victorian England was obsessed with prostitution, sex workers, immoral behaviour. They were so intent on looking down on anybody. Let's have a think. Anybody showing a slightly immoral side, when in fact most of these guys, and they were guys. I'm sorry, chaps who were in the chat, but most of these guys were how would I put it? Dirty buggers, basically. So they were the ones who were visiting prostitutes. They were the ones who had mistresses. They would be the ones who may even be, they might visit brothels, bawdy houses. They were smoking opium. These were upper class pastimes. It wasn't just the working class man who was getting a quick knee trembler for a couple of pennies, but because they were so obsessed with this faux morality, they were coming down hard on women. And I mean, one social commentator, and I know I've discussed this before, there's claims that there were 80,000 prostitutes in London at that time. And there was this real obsession about prostitution, as I've just said, sex workers, and and this had an obvious impact on the case, because the minute somebody said these were unfortunates, which was the Victorian euphemism for sex workers, that was it. Now we're just going to go on to Dr. Llewellyn. So Dr. Llewellyn was the guy who conducted Polly's post-mortem. And if we have a little look at some of the details, it might help us to look at the killer again. Just a little look, because I don't want to make it about Jack the Ripper. This is just about, telling the stories of these women and the fact that, we've got it wrong. Now, what Dr. Llewellyn had noticed was that the right side of her face, there was bruising, which he said looked like it could have been caused by pressure from a thumb. And the fact that where it was on the right side of the face, it suggests, and bear with me because I may be wrong, that, possibly her throat was cut from behind. And if that was the case, and I know some people, have gone with this theory, that this suggested a throat was cut from behind, and that would explain why this killer was able to get away undetected from these murders. If he was cutting these throats from behind, the arterial spray is going to go forward. It's not going to come back over him. He's not going to be covered in blood. He can just make a hasty exit. Now, the violence. Now, this was something I was really surprised at. The actual violence that he did to Polly Nichols, to her abdomen and her genitals. Now, there's an expert. She is a forensic psychologist, and she has said that this is actually really, really rare. This kind of mutilation is really rare. It's only seen in around 10% of cases of serial killings. And at this point, I've got to interject here. At this point, we don't know if this is a serial killer or not. It's the shocking nature of these injuries. That left no doubt in anybody's mind how dangerous this guy was. He was 100%. He was so dangerous, and that just also increased the sensationalism for the press. It's pretty obvious the way that he went at her, and the subsequent victims. It's that there seems to be some severe psychological dysfunction. He's not firing on all cylinders, this guy. This is driving his behavior. And if you look at the press, whenever you get, even today, no, I've not, Cassius. I've not heard Hallie Rubenhold. I'll have a look for it though. Thank you. So, you get any form of a murder even today, and the press are going to label it, psychos, maniacs, nut jobs, lunatics, monsters, you name it, you're going to get these sensational names. And it was no different in Victorian England. The broadsheets at the time, there were a lot of real tatty rags, being published. It was the in thing, and with these newspapers, they were constantly getting updates. You know, you'd get updates up to 4 times a day. So they'd sell one paper at, say, 6 o'clock. There'd be an update to it with updates on the story by, say, 10 o'clock. And then there'd be another update by 2 o'clock and another update by 6. It was constantly here, you know, it was constantly turning around. And the more gory and the more detailed and the more gruesome, the more copies were sold. So, you know, the press, they just had an absolute field day. They lost no time whipping up hysteria with the public. You know, basically with the first reports of the murder, a lot of the language that they used was incredibly graphic. You know, if you look at some of the headlines of the day, and you know, and please do go on to Google and have a look at some of the Jack the Ripper headlines. And you know, it's they really are bad. And a lot of the stuff that they would put in these broadsheets at the time, you wouldn't even get away with today, considering that Victorian London was apparently a hive of morality. The stuff that they were writing about and they were publishing and people were buying was absolutely dreadful. It was absolutely dreadful. But, you know, they got away with doing it. So, you know, despite the number of people living and working where she was found, the police really struggled to find any leads whatsoever. You know, they asked around people who were living in the tenements nearby, people who were working, people who had been, you know, outside in that area at that time. Nobody heard a thing. Nobody. So was this also part of his modus operandi, the fact that he cut the throat from behind to stop them crying out, you know? Or could it have been that she knew him, in which case she wouldn't have cried out? Because another little fact as well, which I found quite fascinating, and it is still applicable today, is that most 94% of women who were murdered, and this is incredibly high, 94% of women who were murdered, there is some element of stalking by the murderer prior to the killing. I found that really frightening, you know, and it doesn't mean that they were being stalked for months, you know. It could be that, you know, I don't know, Polly's walking down the street, she catches the eye of this guy. And I think this is what they were trying to say, you know, she catches the eye of this guy and he decides he's going to follow her and see where she goes and look for an opportunity over the next day or two and then jump her and murder her. So it's I just found that figure very, very high and very, very worrying, you know. So basically, what we're going to say is that Polly was not a prostitute. So she is the first of these 5 women who have been labelled, as I said, by the press. The police did nothing to dispel this. You know, they were asking around, they were questioning people as well. Nobody could come to them and say that Polly ever worked in the sex industry, ever. You know, they had no evidence of her being walking the streets. She'd never been arrested. She'd never been seen in the usual haunts. All she was really guilty of, as I've said, was she was incredibly poor. She was occasionally homeless. She'd left her husband and children, which sounds like she left because she had no other choice because he was seeing somebody else. You know, I know her father is always going to stand up for her, but at the end of the day, you know, there does appear to be some small element of possible truth in that. So, oh, sorry, we're about to get a barky dog. So I don't know what you guys think so far on that. Oops, sorry, I've got a little barky dog. I obviously I only want to do one at a time. I don't want to do I don't want to do 2, 3, 4 in one night, because I think if I do that, we'll then forget about Polly. We'll move on to Annie and we'll have forgot what Polly's story was. Yeah, and I've seen a photograph of it. I was trying to upload the photograph, Fern. She wasn't an ugly woman by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, you do see the drawings that were made of her when she was in the mortuary, and you can see that she's got some of this bloat into the face, which is, um, which is typical for heavy drinkers, which is what she was. What's that? She wasn't educated. Well, actually, Fern, no, Polly was. Her father had paid for her education. He was determined that his three children were going to be educated. So he was quite unusual in the fact that he was willing to pay for, not only to pay for his child to be educated, but a daughter, which was virtually unheard of. The daughters just didn't go into education. They might have got a job as a scullery maid. They might have got a job in a mill, depending where they were living. Flower sellers. Well, that's it. They were heavy drinkers, and a lot of that was because the water was unsafe. The water was unsafe to drink. So instead, and that goes right back, you're talking even in Tudor times and earlier, you'd see that they'd been having wine or beer with every meal. They'd even have it with breakfast. Well, it wasn't beer like we would know it. It was a very watered down version of it, but it was safer than drinking the water. And it was the same in London. The water supply was polluted, horrendously so. But also, people were brewing their own drinks in the, in the back rooms and what have you. And it was so strong, some of this alcohol that they were brewing would take the lining off the bath. So, yeah. Let's see. I'll go back through my comments and see what we've got. Lady Witch saying always the immoral behavior on behalf of the woman. Yeah, it is. It's always the women. Yeah, rotting the teeth as well. Yeah. And some of these women had they had like TB. That was absolutely rampant. I don't know about syphilis or anything like that. I think that one of the women did have it, but it's not necessarily from from working in the sex industry. And we'll cover that in probably the next one or two, and I'll cover that one and who that is. But yeah, it's just looking at it, and I felt so bad because you say the 5 prostitutes that that Jack the Ripper killed. In these times, a woman could be committed for reading on a Sunday and be labelled a prostitute. Absolutely. Women who were pregnant and unmarried were labelled as prostitutes. They were actually registered as sex workers if they were unfortunate enough, and yeah, it was awful, 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 awful. And this didn't necessarily mean somebody was living immoral. It could be as a result of, an assault, anything really. End up in Bedlam was better than the workhouse. Yeah, well, I mean, and this has been going on until fairly recently as well. Look at, that film, The Magdalene Sisters. Yeah, yeah, you're right, Fern. The husband would get bored of you, and that was enough. Um, and it's so sad. It's so sad that the women didn't have a right to stand up for themselves. If the husband said, "That's it, I've had enough, it's over, ta," they had absolutely no recourse whatsoever. They were, as I said before, if you didn't conform to society's opinion of what a woman should be, then you were castigated, you were ostracized, you were shamed, you were shunned, and you were judged. And unfortunately, that's what's happened to these victims. The press automatically judged them. The press judged them as, they were poor women, they were without husbands, they may have been married and separated from husbands or widowed or whatever. They could have been living with a man, whatever it was that they were doing, living with a man that they weren't married to. They were, they were loose women. And it's such a shame. It's such a shame. So that's why I'm wanting to do this, because I've got some really good information on the other ladies as well. And I just thought, just for a short little series, it would be quite interesting, hopefully, and people are finding it quite interesting. We only shut down these massive mental institutes in the outskirts of all our towns, packed with women until the 80s. Really? I didn't know that, Fern. Wow. Wow, that's really sad. That's really sad. Going to go for a wee while Egyptian kebab. Or Egyptian kebab? I'd like to know, what is an Egyptian kebab, or do I not want to know? I'm wondering whether I'll be quite scared to find out. Right. All put away for years for such minor things like skipping. Really? Wow. Wow. So, does anybody want to know anything else about Polly? Guys, I might have to close this down and come back. I've just seen that I've had a text message from a former friend, and I think I'm going to have to reply to it. Point is, these women surviving, etc. on the streets were actually okay. There are a lot of women listening in and trying to cook and burn beans. Oh, are you? Oh, flipping heck. Yeah, I really need to reply to this text message. I'm really sorry, guys, because I don't know whether to leave it running. Because I normally, if I try and respond to a text message, I'm going to lose camel meat cooked in camel meat. You're kidding me? Ugh. No way. I don't think I could eat camel meat. It's too. I mean, I know it's not, but it would remind me too much of a bit like a horse. Right, I will. I'll come back. I'll close this down, and I will come back. But I'm gonna have to reply to this text message. Because it's something I'm not gonna be able to leave. Even though I'm doing a live. I am so sorry about this, everybody. So I'll be back very, very soon. So hang around. or listen back to what's going on, I'll respond to this, and then I will open up another live, and hopefully it'll be, you know, within the next like 10, 15 minutes. All right, guys, thank you very much. I'm sorry I'm going to have to run, but I will be back.